BL Story of Love invites the viewer to dive into a new forbidden story. There will be no safe choices here, only wounded hearts, dangerous deals, and unexpected love in a place where it has no right to exist. If the viewer wants more stories like this, they should subscribe, hit the like button right now, and listen to the story until the very end, in headphones and with the lights off, so they do not miss a single emotional nuance. The city lived through a viscous, damp chill of an evening. The snow that had fallen during the day had turned into dirty slush by night, and the wind lifted sticky clumps of wet ice from the asphalt, mixed with torn advertising flyers. The streetlights gave off a murky yellow-gray light under which everything looked equally tired. The buildings, the few passers-by, even the air itself. An Omega named Leon walked slowly, as if each movement had to be dragged out of his body by force. He shoved his hands deeper into the pockets of someone else's jacket he had once found in a container behind a shopping mall. The jacket was one size too big, worn thin in places, the zipper stuck, the filling clumped together and no longer kept him warm. But for Leon, it was still better than nothing. The cold crept through the holes in the fabric to his skin, but not all the way to the bone, which meant it was bearable. He moved along the glowing windows as if along shop fronts with goods he could never afford. Behind the glass, where the shadows of people moved, ordinary things lived their quiet lives. Kettles whistled on stoves, someone laughed at a TV show, someone argued over homework, someone simply walked barefoot from room to room across a warm floor. Leon looked at these fragments of someone else's normality and tried not to let himself think too much. If he stopped for even a moment, a dull, dragging ache rose in his chest, one that nothing could numb. He had no home, not even a permanent bed in a shelter. He had a set of points on a map, like dots in a children's Connect the Lines game, an entryway where the janitor sometimes let him ride out the worst frosts in exchange for a couple of hours of sweeping, a night shop whose warm exhaust wall he could lean against, a couple of cheap bars that tolerated him until closing if he quietly took out the trash and didn't get underfoot. A few months ago, he had still had a room in an old communal apartment with peeling wallpaper and a creaky bed, but the landlord decided that a sick Omega with unstable hormones and a clinic certificate was nothing but trouble. He simply informed Leon of the fact. Pack your things. Now, the landlord had said then, not looking him in the eye. Half an hour later, all of Leon's belongings fit into one battered backpack. He had to leave some books behind. Those were what hurt to lose the most. Since then, Leon had lived from odd job to odd job. He unloaded goods in the backyards of supermarkets until his hands started shaking from the weight of the boxes. He scrubbed sticky floors in bars closing at dawn, where the smell of spilled alcohol soaked so deeply into his skin and clothes that even cheap bleach couldn't cover it. Sometimes he earned a handful of money by donating plasma at a rundown clinic, where the staff already knew him by name and by veins. His body was exhausted from the constant tests and needles. The skin at the crooks of his arms was covered in bruises and catheter marks that lingered for a long time. But Leon had no other way to survive. Fatigue and hidden diagnoses slowly accumulated in his body, diagnoses he preferred not to think about. He knew that somewhere out there, in medical files, next to his last name, there were words Omegas were usually not allowed to read aloud: hormonal failure, elevated risk of complications, chronic anemia. But thoughts about the future felt too much like a dead end, so he cut them off, the way you cut out unnecessary noise from a recording. That evening, he was on his way back from a soup kitchen at a church. They served food there according to a schedule: thin soup, a little porridge, a piece of bread. He got a plate of warm soup, tasting almost like water, but the heat spread through his empty stomach and dulled the hunger for a few hours. The volunteer at the counter gave him a tired smile, wished him to hang in there, and Leon stepped back out into the cold. Near the exit, on an old post flaking from age and endless layers of taped and ripped notices, he noticed something new. The sheet was bright, not yet soaked by the snow, the paper thick and white. The text was printed evenly, with tidy margins and no mistakes. You could feel the hand of someone used to office printers and neat layouts, not to scribbled handwritten ads. Leon stepped closer. In the light of the street lamp, the letters were clear. The announcement was short, but every paragraph hit him in the head. A private clinic. Urgently seeking organ donors for a complex but standard operation. Physically relatively healthy alphas, betas, omegas required. Full anonymity. Legal support. In a separate line, special conditions for omegas, with a hint at higher pay and an extended follow-up package after the procedure. The amount listed at the bottom looked to Leon like impossible wealth. His imagination automatically began to break it into parts. How many months he could rent a small place of his own. How much would be left for examinations, proper medicine, clothes that weren't someone's throwaways but actually his size. It was a chance not to stand in line at the soup kitchen, not to wring the last strength out of his body for jobs that made it crack at the seams. He caught himself as his fingers twitched slightly, as if reaching to tear off the sheet and hide it in his pocket like a talisman. His heart clenched. Two feelings stirred in his chest, long forgotten in such a sharp form. Fear and greedy, almost painful hope. The fear was old, familiar. Leon had seen and heard too much to believe in the purity of offers like this. He knew stories about illegal clinics where donors vanished without a trace. About schemes where anonymity meant no one would ever find out what they did to you. In his circles, there were legends about flyers just like this, after which people either came back with their eyes full of emptiness or never came back at all, but the hope was just as real. In his position, the word dangerous had long since lost its original weight. His life was already dangerous. Nights in freezing stairwells, sudden waves of weakness in the middle of the street, the whistling wind through broken shelter windows. Dangerous was when you fell asleep and weren't sure whether you'd wake from the cold or just stop feeling your fingers for good. Next to all that, the neat line, surgical risk, read almost like a familiar melody. He stood under the lamp while the wind tugged at the flyer, peeling its edges from the glue. Someone walked by, sneezed, muttered something about another rich people scam, but Leon no longer heard. He was mentally trying the numbers on for size, adding, subtracting, laying them out over time. How many days he would need to recover. How many weeks he could live without collapsing from hunger. How many months he would have to find at least some kind of steady job while his body still held together. Maybe that's how people get out of the pit, the thought flickered. They just do something normal people would never dare. He tore his gaze away from the paper and looked around, as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows and say, "Don't you dare." No one was there. Only the cross above the dining hall entrance, a black outline against the dark sky, and a few cars on the road throwing reflections of their headlights across puddles. Dangerous, he said to himself quietly, almost soundlessly. The answer was a gust of wind that slapped an old torn flyer into his face. Leon brushed the paper away and let out a short, bitter chuckle. "What difference does it make?" he whispered. That argument sounded more honest than any other. That night, lying on a hard bunk in the overcrowded shelter, he kept returning to the post by the church in his thoughts. The room smelled of damp clothing, old dust, and exhaustion. The beds were crammed so close together they nearly touched. Other people's bodies warmed the air but gave no sense of safety. Someone moaned softly in their sleep. Someone murmured a prayer. Someone else cursed under their breath. Leon shifted from side to side, feeling the springs digging into his back. His backpack, padded with his jacket, served as a pillow under his head. Every time he closed his eyes, the neat white paper with its tidy letters and indecently large figure at the bottom floated up before him. He counted the numbers and the days. How many more nights he could endure in this room, where every stranger's cough reminded him how thin the line was between fainting and final shutdown. Without a drastic move, without some desperate decision, the best he could hope for was a slow burnout on the streets. First, his body would stop enduring the cold and hunger. Then, his shoulders would finally sag under the weight of pointless visits to employment offices that didn't hire omegas with his diagnoses. Then, the usual end in a nameless ward of a cheap hospital where a tired nurse would put a tick next to the word alone. The announcement on the post started sounding in his head like the only real opportunity to change his trajectory. Not necessarily for the better, that was still to be seen, but at least into a different one. Any other line seemed better than the endless loop of shelter, street, clinic, odd job, shelter. He listened as someone nearby quietly whispered, "God, give me a chance," and realized his own request to the world sounded much more prosaic. Not a miracle, not love. Just a chance to pay for a room and for tests. "All right," he murmured into the darkness, not knowing whom he was talking to. The decision wasn't yet wrapped in words at that moment, but the internal switch had already flipped. In the morning, he would get up, go back to that post, copy the address of the private clinic onto a scrap of paper, and step into a place normal people tried not to look at, simply because the normal path had long been closed to him. The morning didn't start with an alarm. It started with a decision that could no longer be rolled back. Leon woke in the shelter earlier than the others, while a murky gray half-light still hung in the hall, and lay there for a while, listening to the breathing of strangers. The memory of the white flyer on the post surfaced by itself, like a jingle from an ad you never meant to learn but know by heart anyway. He got up, trying not to wake his neighbors on the bunks, smoothed the wrinkled collar of his jacket with his hands, and went outside before the air had time to fill with exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke. The city was unusually quiet at that hour. Buses were only just starting their engines. The first pedestrians hurried toward the subway. Leon walked to the post by the church, checked whether the announcement was still there. The sheet was in place, only the edges had puffed slightly from the moisture. He wrote the clinic's address on the back of an old receipt, shoved the paper into his pocket, and headed toward the center. The closer he got to the specified district, the clearer he felt the world around him changing its skin. The place where the private clinic was located belonged to a completely different map of the city. There were no empty bottles by the doorways here. The facades were freshly painted, and in front of building entrances stood neat tubs with winter plants. The signs glowed softly and steadily, with no flickering neon and screaming fonts. Even among these buildings, the clinic stood out. Clean, smooth lines of glass and pale stone, mirrored doors reflecting Leon's thin figure. He stopped automatically, looked at his reflection, and for a second saw himself through someone else's eyes. A narrow face, cheeks drawn in by fatigue, dark circles under his eyes, short hair he couldn't hide behind. The jacket hung like a sack, his pants were clearly the wrong size, and his sneakers had once been white, but long ago turned gray. Everything about him screamed, no insurance, no permanent address. He inhaled deeply to smother the strange feeling of not belonging and pushed open the door. Inside, the smell was different, sterile, dense. Antiseptic, expensive plastic, a faint sweet hint of paper, and a thin trace of coffee from a staff vending machine. The light seemed too bright after the street. Everything around him gleamed with cleanliness, as if dirt, slushy snow by sidewalks, and people with empty hands simply didn't exist in this space. The receptionist behind the desk looked up at him, swept her eyes over him from head to toe, and instantly categorized what type of visitor he was. Not someone arriving with an appointment, a surname, and insurance. Not someone stepping out of a black car with personal security. Someone who had seen the flyer. She didn't look at him with open disgust or outright hostility. More with that slight contempt of a person who knows the value of their salary and is used to people like him coming and going. Professional detachment, a stretched-on smile, a mechanical voice asking standard questions. Name, age, status. Phone, none. Address, no permanent address. At that, a brief figures flashed in her eyes. The system for people like him was indeed streamlined. The receptionist pressed a few keys, printed out a slip with a number, and asked him to sit and wait. Leon sat down on the edge of a plastic chair, feeling the smooth, cold surface under him. Next to him were two men of indeterminate age and an Omega with nervous fingers twisting the edge of her bag. All of them stared either at the floor or at a fixed point on the wall. No one spoke. They called him fairly quickly, not by name, by number. In the narrow corridor, the smell was stronger than in the lobby. Here the antiseptic hit his nose like a reminder that behind the clean white walls there was metal and blood. He was led into a small office where, instead of a doctor, a dry, neat lawyer was waiting for him. This man looked as if he'd been pulled straight out of a prestigious law firm. Perfectly pressed shirt, thin tie, neat metal-framed glasses, a smile polished by dozens of client meetings. On the desk in front of him lay a stack of papers, edges aligned. The lawyer introduced himself by name and position, but it dissolved from Leon's memory immediately. Only the words "terms of the deal" stayed important. He spoke in an even, slightly monotonous voice, like a newsreader reciting a text he knew by heart. A kidney donor was needed for a critical patient. The operation was complex, but by the protocol. The clinic needed someone without serious chronic diseases, without legal complications, without relatives who might interfere. The money would be transferred after a successful transplantation, partly to a bank card if he had one, the rest in cash with a receipt. In case of complications, the clinic would bear limited liability within the framework of the signed agreement. Leon sat with his shoulders slumped, feeling the words flowing above him, sometimes catching, sometimes sliding past. He grasped the key ones: money, successful operation, limited liability. The rest felt like fog. Then the lawyer flipped through the stack and moved on to something else. To a standard civil partnership form, to some legal construction needed to simplify inheritance and insurance schemes. He mentioned that to ensure the lawful transfer of funds and access to medical information, the donor had to temporarily enter into a registered union with the recipient. Formally, a technical marriage that did not imply cohabitation or mutual obligations. After all procedures were completed, the union would be annulled through a simplified procedure. Leon blinked. The words registered union and marriage clicked in his head like latches he had never dared approach. Something jolted inside him. Why? He forced out hoarsely, almost in a whisper. The lawyer was ready for that question. He even smiled a bit wider, as if he'd been waiting for that exact line. He started talking about insurance companies, about inheritance, about how in serious operations it was easier to work with close relatives or spouses than with unrelated persons. How such a union simplified issuing powers of attorney, access to intensive care, and so on. How this was common practice for closed, high-level procedures and did not affect the donor's real life. Some pages in the stack were laid out so that the eye skimmed over them. Tiny print, lengthy paragraphs, references to sections of legal codes. The lawyer smoothly turned the sheets, leaving Leon only the blank spaces for signatures and a few short phrases in a large font. Consent to intervention, waiver of financial claims if complications fell under standard risk. Confirmation that after the operation, he would be brought to consciousness and sent to place of residence, as he indicated. The words, place of residence, floated up in his mind like a shard of ice. He had no such place. A shelter was not an address. A stairwell was not a home. A street was not a destination. But the lawyer did not seem interested. No one asked about his biography. No one cared who would meet him, who would take him home, who would give him a glass of water if he felt unwell. There was something frighteningly convenient in that. Leon suddenly understood that he fit the scheme perfectly, one where no one would ask extra questions after the operation. No family. No official job. No friends who would show up and create a scene. If he vanished tomorrow, the world of that precise, tidy lawyer would not even notice. He felt the trick. Not in a specific phrase, but like a dark shadow lying over the entire offer. It was strange to sign a marriage with a person he had never seen. Strange to give away part of his own body for someone's life without knowing their face. Strange to agree to an annulment of something that had not yet happened, but every time anxiety rose in him, the lawyer gently steered his attention away. He spoke of insurance, of the clinic's reputation, of how there was no place for black schemes here. He added that any donor could refuse up until the moment of signing, and only after that would the real work begin. There was no threat in his voice, only weary professionalism. After the legal block, they sent him for a medical examination. The tone changed here. The doctors and nurses looked at him differently, not as social trash, but as a work object. Cold but attentive, the first hours passed in corridors and consulting rooms, blood and urine tests, endless vials, an ECG with sticky cups being pressed to his chest, leaving red circles behind. An ultrasound of his abdomen, cold gel spread over his skin as the doctor moved the probe, peering at gray smudges on the screen. They took his blood pressure, listened to his breathing, asked standard questions about past illnesses. The Omega specialist he saw closer to noon was different. A short, middle-aged man with gray at his temples and a tired gaze. His voice carried not only fatigue but also a muted compassion he tried to hide beneath professional dryness. He explained again the risks of donation for an Omega, increased strain on the remaining kidney, possible hormonal imbalances, the complexity of future pregnancies, if there were any at all. He spoke honestly, without sugarcoating. The word death came up several times, not as a threat but as a statistical point. Leon listened, nodding, and felt each phrase echo faintly but distinctly inside him. A life that already clung on by sheer will would become even more fragile. And yet, on the horizon, Another image formed. A small room, even in a shabby building, but with his own key in the lock. Clean sheets. Curtains at the window. A coat rack holding more than one jacket. The chance to sleep without fearing someone would come and boot him out in the middle of the night. He had already begun to spend the promised sum in his mind. He saw himself walking into a store and buying food not just for that day, but for several days at once. Paying for tests at a place that wouldn't throw him out for lacking insurance. Fear for his health slid to second place, like a background track you choose not to boost in the mix. By evening, the circle was complete. They brought him back to the lawyer. A prepared packet of documents waited on the table. Sheets with his data already filled in, and pages with the printed name and surname of the recipient. A rare surname, a couple of initials. Nothing that set off alarm bells, no corporate giants, no clan names whispered in shelters. Just an abstract, critical patient. Leon stared at the letters for a long time. They meant nothing to him. There was no image behind them, no face. Only the fact, somewhere beyond the clinic's walls lay a stranger who needed his kidney. The pen in his fingers felt too heavy. In his memory, the church post, the shelter, the hard bed, and the dirty snow returned. So did his own reflection in the glass doors that morning. And next to all that, the neat digits of the sum they had promised him. If the transplantation is successful, he repeated to himself the phrase he had heard several times that day. If. A small word he was ready to cling to. He signed, under the consent form, under the waiver of claims, under the technical marriage with a person he had never seen. Each signature was like a small cut across his life, but sheet by sheet the stack of papers turned from someone else's forms into his personal point of no return. When it was over, the lawyer carefully stacked the documents in a folder, thanked him with a standard phrase, and passed him back to a nurse. She explained that in the morning he would be admitted, and that for now he could put his affairs in order. Leon had nothing to put in order. He walked out of the clinic into the dark winter evening with his legs full of cotton and a strange emptiness in his chest. He had no idea that somewhere on the other side of the city, in an elite ward with its own security post, a similar neat lawyer was reporting to a critical alpha with a rare surname that a donor had been found, the papers were signed, the technical marriage registered, and that this alpha was not just any patient, but a man whose name could split someone's life in half the moment he opened his eyes. They moved him at night, when the clinic corridors were almost empty, and the light in the ceiling fixtures had turned dim and cold. A nurse in a gray uniform rolled his bed from the common ward into a separate box where everything looked as if the room had been freshly assembled from a catalog. The walls were evenly white, without a single stain. The window was covered by thick blinds that let in no streetlight. The bed stood neatly in the center, the sheets stretched so tight it almost squeaked. In the corner, a monitor glowed faintly, silent for now, as if waiting to be connected to its next patient. Even the silence here was different, not the tired one, filled with coughs and rustling, like in a shelter, but artificial and filtered. The nurse came almost at once, as if she'd been waiting behind the door. Young, her hair perfectly tied back, with a light scent of expensive cream. She checked the bracelet on his wrist, compared the data with a tablet, connected sensors to his chest and finger with practiced movements. The cold pads of the electrodes stuck to his skin, thin wires snaked toward the monitor. The screen woke up and displayed his pulse as an uneven green line. She used standard, well-rehearsed phrases. The operation was scheduled for early morning. He must not eat or drink until then. They would put him on IV fluids to maintain his balance. Her voice carried neither sympathy nor irritation. Just another stage of her shift. Leon stared at the ceiling, feeling the needle slide into a vein on the back of his hand. A slight burn, then the cool flow of fluid up his arm. When the nurse taped the line in place and left, the door closed with a soft click, muffling the outside world. He was alone with the white ceiling, the blinking numbers on the monitor, and his heavy, viscous awareness. His thoughts kept crashing against the same wall. Tomorrow his body would change, not in some metaphorical social sense, but literally. One organ would be gone for good. Until now, he had thought of himself as whole, if battered. That sense of integrity now cracked. From now on, there would be one part less inside him. He tried to distract himself, but his brain drew diagrams instead. Somewhere beyond the walls, perhaps in another wing, they were preparing the alpha whose life this mechanism was built to save. Doctors were discussing the protocol. Night staff were whispering in the break room. The finance department had already scheduled who would get paid and when. In that machine, he was not the center, but a bolt that could be swapped out if something went wrong. Sleep wouldn't come, only short, heavy dips. Each time he sank down, something inside jerked and he surfaced again into the white light. Time dragged, sticky. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, measuring out the remnants of the night. Closer to the early morning, when his body hovered between fatigue and exhaustion, he heard voices beyond the wall. The sound was muffled, but in the night silence every word sliced through the space like a blade. One voice belonged to a doctor. Leon had already memorized that intonation, calm, trained. Now there was tension in it that hadn't been there during the day. The second voice came from a phone speaker. Through the thin wall, only fragments broke through, but that was enough. The doctor was speaking to someone he called boss, clarifying details, talking about a complex case, urgency, the share of risk they were taking on themselves. His tone held respect mixed with caution. The way people talk not to a department head, but to someone whose influence reaches far beyond medicine. And then the name came. It hit his awareness like an icy gust of air bursting into the ward. Leon didn't quite believe he'd heard it right. The name was too familiar, too out of place in the sterile quiet of a private clinic. It belonged not to the world that pretended to live by the law, but to the world that had been writing its own for a long time. He had heard that surname in shelters where people traded stories over cheap alcohol. He had heard it in old news segments on battered TVs in soup kitchens. In crime reports, when anchors spoke of yet another shootout, clandestine clubs, shady cargo schemes, and vanished people. People spoke that name in whispers, even when they pretended not to fear anyone. The doctor behind the wall pronounced it calmly, without a tremor, as part of a chart. For him, it was just a patient. For the city, it was an alpha whose death would shake not only crime headlines, but the entire balance of power. Leon realized his kidney was not going to some rich man, as he had imagined, but to a specific mafia boss, a legend of nighttime stories. A man on whose conscience probably lay not just shadow deals, but dozens, maybe hundreds of shattered lives, omegas held in locked houses, betas disappearing after one wrong deal, alphas vanishing from the news after the word investigation. Something twisted inside him, a thought flared up, raw and dirty. Why him? Why his body, his organ, had to prolong the life of someone who could buy any help? Why not take a kidney from one of his own men? From someone who would volunteer for the clan, for status, for some mythical honor? Why pick a homeless Omega who belonged to no one and wouldn't be missed? For a second, he wanted to rip the hospital bracelet off, yank out the IV, stand up and stagger out. To say he'd changed his mind. That he wouldn't save a monster, even if that monster lay in the next ward hooked up to machines. But the moment the thought was born, it smashed into a glass wall of reality. The contracts were signed. The tests done. They'd already begun prepping his body. IVs, restrictions, medications. Behind this night stood an entire chain of people, from the lawyer to the anesthesiologist. For the clinic, he was no longer a man, but a resource reserved for a specific operation. Backing out now wasn't just, I changed my mind. It meant clashing with a system used to paper words weighing more than any spoken ones. He lay there listening to the scraps of conversation, feeling the protest inside him harden into a stone. Yes, he was about to save the life of a man people feared even when denying he existed. But he was no longer in a position to choose whose heart should keep beating. Toward morning, sleep finally did what nothing else could. It switched him off. Briefly and sharply, like a thrown breaker. They woke him with light, bright, cutting into his eyes. The nurse slipped into the room almost silently, raised the blinds, checked the monitor, entered something into his chart. Her voice sounded a little softer than at night, but the words were the same. Soon they would wheel him to the pre-op. There would be prep, then the operating room, anesthesia. He wouldn't feel a thing. They helped him transfer to a gurney, tucked his thin legs under the sheet, fastened straps across his chest and thighs, not tight, just enough so he wouldn't slide off. The metal under his back was cold to the bone. Leon stared at the ceiling, watching the lamps float past one by one like angry white suns. The corridors seemed endless. In one, he glimpsed another unit out of the corner of his eye. The wide door with card access, the sign for intensive care, a guard post. Behind the glass, he caught the shadow of a large body on a high bed, surrounded by machines. It wasn't likely to be anyone else. Someone on that side was also being prepared for a reconfigured future. And that someone bore the surname which made conversations die out in shelters. The pre-op room greeted him with a different smell. Here the antiseptic mixed with the sharp scent of solution used to scrub skin and the sweetish aroma of drugs. The doctors and assistants moved smoothly, almost wordlessly. They pulled a cap over his hair, changed him into a thin gown that chilled his skin. Again, they checked his bracelet, cross-checked numbers and letters, made sure his name and surname matched what was in the papers. They spent a few minutes prepping the surgical field, disinfecting, marking. Cold hands touched his body with the confidence of mechanics about to take apart an engine. He was under their gaze, but not at the center of it. The center was the protocol. Shut one thing down, hook another in, move a piece of him into someone else. When they rolled him into the operating theater, his world narrowed to the circle of bright light above his head. The lamps glared so hard he wanted to squint, but he didn't. In that strange, almost ceremonial moment, it felt important. As long as he kept watching, he still controlled at least something. The OR was cold, not just in temperature, but in metal. Metal instruments on trays, metal stands, metal poles with hanging bags of fluid. Metal made a dry, ringing sound, every clink seeming louder than it was. The people in caps and masks all looked the same. He didn't try to tell them apart. The anesthesiologist bent over him, checked the tubes, briefly explained they were about to start the medication. Made sure the IV line was flowing. Leon felt a cold stream run up his arm. A mask came down over his face, smelling of rubber and something chemical that made him want to turn away. But it was too late to move his head. The air under the mask was foreign, heavy. He tried to breathe evenly, but panic still rose inside him. Images flashed in his mind like badly edited film cuts. The filthy mattress in the shelter where they woke him with kicks. The flyer shaking in the wind. The lawyer's office, that even voice, the words, technical marriage. The white walls of the ward. The name he'd heard through the wall and the whispers in shelters when someone recounted how that man had settled someone's fate. A fair deal, the thought appeared unexpectedly, as if someone had fed it to him. In some warped sense, it really did look like a deal. He was giving up part of himself to buy a chance at a new life. Selling a kidney for a few months of sleep in his own room, for a shot at taking a few steps forward instead of treading the same spot. The price was terrifying. But it felt like things couldn't get worse than they already were. At the bottom of the pit he'd fallen into, there had been no choices at all. The darkness didn't come at once. First came the feeling that someone had turned the world's volume down. Sounds grew softer, voices dulled. His heart was still beating fast, but each beat echoed hollowly. His arms and legs filled with cotton. At some point he stopped feeling the weight of his own body. All the sounds started to recede. The surgeon's commands, the beeping of machines, the rustling of gloves, they all stepped one pace back, then 2, then 10. The world shrank, compressing into a single point where only his heartbeat remained. He heard it a few more times. One beat, another, a third. Each thud sounded like the last note of an old, painfully familiar melody. Then, even that rhythm dissolved into thick black syrup, and the operating room was gone. Where the lamps, the people, the metal had been a minute ago, there was nothing. Just flat, total darkness. He fell into it, like into a bottomless well, not knowing whether someone else would ever wake up at the top. Someone with one kidney instead of 2 and a fate already sealed on paper. Consciousness didn't return smoothly. It came in jagged strips like an old film with the reel tearing. First, Leon felt his own body. It was heavy, as if someone had tied rocks to it and forgotten to untie them. Each breath brought a dull, nagging weight in his side, as if a tight hook had been screwed in under his ribs. He tried to move and stopped at once as the pain sharpened, slashing from inside, warning him not to make any sudden motions. Then, he registered the feel of the fabric under his fingers. The sheet was unusually soft, dense, and smooth. Not the stiff, overwashed hospital linens he knew from public clinics, but something expensive, with a subtle rustle at every tiny movement. His cheek lay on a pillow that actually supported his head instead of digging a lump into the back of his skull. The smell was different, not bleach and cheap soap, not a mix of sweat, medicine, and unwashed corridors. The air was dry and clean, with a faint hint of polished wood and fresh laundry. Farther away, at the edge of perception, lingered a subtle smell of tobacco and expensive cigars, carefully aired out, but not entirely gone. As if someone regularly smoked nearby and then opened the windows, yet the walls remembered. Leon listened. There was no usual hospital noise around him, no IV alarms, no heavy steps in the corridor, no distant nurse voices chatting. Only the soft, even hum of an air system under the ceiling and the occasional measured beep from a machine he seemed to be attached to. He carefully opened his eyes. The ceiling wasn't the one he was used to. Not an endless white slab with stains and cracks, but a neat light surface with a cleanly built-in lamp. The light was soft, not stabbing his eyes. The frame of a wall, a corner, a slice of window with a heavy curtain slowly came into focus. He turned his head a little to the right and winced again as pain flared along his side. The room was large, too large for a regular ward. Along one wall stood a sleek, handleless wardrobe. Next to it a side table with an integrated control panel blinking with numbers and incomprehensible icons. On the other side of the bed, he saw a jug of water and two proper glasses instead of disposable cups. In the corner, a high-backed armchair upholstered in dark fabric. The floor was covered by a soft carpet that would swallow footsteps when someone came up to the bed. He jerked, trying to raise his hand, and only then noticed the IV. A clear tube ran from a stand into the vein on the back of his hand, held with taped dressing. Under the sheet he felt more tubes. Something tugged in his groin and under his left knee. His body wasn't just heavy, it felt foreign, wired into systems keeping him in this strange in-between state. The door didn't open right away. First, something about the air shifted, the stillness eased. Then he heard quiet steps on the carpet, and a figure in a light coat slid into view at the edge of his vision. The doctor checked the machines without looking at him. Skilled fingers tapped something on a tablet, listened to his chest, probed gently around the incision. The pain from that touch was unpleasant but bearable. Only then did the doctor spare him a brief look, stating that the operation had gone well, that his body was reacting as expected, that he needed rest and not to get himself worked up. Leon tried to ask questions. Where he was, why he wasn't in the same ward, when they would discharge him. When he would get the promised money, the answers were thick and slippery. Everything was fine. He'd been moved to a more secure room for his own safety. It was too early to talk about discharge. They needed to monitor him. The administration handled financial matters. They would definitely contact him. They spoke as if he were asking for extra favors, though he simply wanted something solid to hold on to. The doctor left as quietly as he had come. The door shut with a soft click, shutting out the rest of the world. Leon was alone again, in a room clearly not meant for homeless organ donors. He tried to push himself up on his right elbow. A sharp, ripping pain shot through his side. Sweat broke across his forehead. His vision swam. He had to freeze, swallow hard, and wait for the pain to dull. But even that slight shift was enough to tilt the horizon, and he finally saw what had been hiding out of sight. On the small table by the bed lay a folder, plain plastic with a snap closure. The clinic logo on the cover and a sticker with his name. It hadn't been locked in a drawer or held in the doctor's hands. It simply lay within easy reach, as if someone had deliberately left it there. Curiosity outweighed fear. Leon, his teeth clenched, reached for the folder, bracing his side with his free hand. His fingers shook. The plastic creaked under his nails. He dragged it closer and sank back onto the pillow with it on his stomach. Opening it was scarier than going under the knife. Inside were familiar sheets. Copies of what he had signed before surgery. Consent to donation, waiver of claims, medical forms with his test results. Each document bore the clinic's note, stamp, neat small print signatures, lawyer, head doctor, witnesses. But beneath that lay other papers. A discharge summary, written in the dry language of medicine, stating that the transplantation was done, that the donor was stable, that the recipient had been moved to intensive care. Several registration forms with stamps from outside agencies. And one sheet on heavier paper with an embossed emblem at the top, a certificate. His eyes refused to focus on the lines at first. He blinked, slowed his breathing, let the letters form words. In the spouse's field were two names. One was his own, familiar, even if it rarely appeared in print. The other, that of the Alpha, whose surname had been whispered under shelter roofs and spoken on crime news. Leon reread it several times as if that could change anything. The name, The surname, the date of registration, the act number at the bottom, signatures. His smeared scrawl from the day the lawyer had told him this was a technical union needed solely for insurance and inheritance procedures. Next to it, a clear, confident signature of the second party. Below that, the stamp of the registry office, the emblem, more official markings. Everything was done strictly according to the law, not a temporary fiction, not a draft, not an internal clinic document. A real marriage certificate, registered, entered into the database, approved at all levels. A legal fact now existing independently of his wishes, doubts, and feeble attempts to convince himself it was just paperwork. He tried to replay the pre-op scene. The lawyer talking about a legal construction, briefly mentioning a civil partnership, subtly shifting some sheets so his signatures went one after another. Back then, Leon had been too consumed by his own fear and thoughts of money. The words, technical marriage, had slipped into his mind as something fleeting and light, almost playful. As if someone would hang a different surname on him for a minute and then take it back. Apparently, no one had intended to take anything back. The longer he looked at the certificate, the stronger his sense that the world he'd woken up in no longer matched the one he'd fallen asleep in under anesthesia. Before the operation, he'd been a homeless omega who could be called anything on paper: donor, patient, temporary partner. Now he was listed as the legal spouse of a man whose name already sat at the center of too many stories. He tried to imagine what that meant, not in a romantic or domestic way, but in very concrete legal terms. Spouse. The word granted rights, imposed obligations. It worked him into wills and insurance policies. It made him part of a clan he had nothing to do with. It turned him from a non-existent nobody into a figure who, on paper, stood next to a Mafia alpha. His consciousness refused to accept the obvious. A brain trained on basic survival schemes couldn't swallow this new scale. He had been ready to wake up weak, with stitches and pain. Ready to be sent back out onto the street with an envelope and maybe a warning not to strain himself. He had not been ready to find, instead of the street, strange walls, strange air, and a strange life he'd been plugged into without a say. From somewhere in the corridor came a quiet sound. A soft clink of dishes, a muted male voice in which he caught the word spouse. Leon froze, listening, but the phrase melted back into the general noise. Only that one word hung in the air like a foreign, ridiculous label. Spouse. He looked again at his name in the document line next to a surname he'd previously only heard on the news and in crime stories. The stitches in his side ached, his head spun, and beneath the nauseating wave of weakness, another, colder feeling rose. What have you done to me? The words sounded inside him, voiceless but sharp, as if he had shouted them. There was no answer. Only soft walls, sheets that were far too expensive, the folder with its stamps, and a fact he could no longer unsee. He had woken up not just with a part of him inside someone else, but legally bound to that someone by a law no one was planning to undo. The first days after waking stretched into a thick, colorless time. Strong painkillers smoothed out the edges of his pain, turning it into a heavy pressure, but they slowed his thinking as well. Leon lay under the soft blanket, stared at the ceiling, and felt the balance inside him shift. His body was trying to get used to its new state, to the absence of a piece of itself, to the scar that tugged with every deeper breath, but his body adjusted faster than his mind. At first, he clung to the basics. A sip of water, a nurse's visit, a bandage change, a short walk around the room supported under the elbow. Between these mundane acts, though, came the bigger questions. They hurt more than his side. Where had the shelter gone? Where was the envelope with cash? Why was he in a room that cost more than anything he'd ever owned instead of being discharged to a cheap hostel? The answers didn't come quickly and not honestly. One afternoon, a man in a perfectly tailored suit came to see him. Not a doctor and not a guard, a lawyer. He carried a folder in his hands and a professional mask on his face, his voice marked by that special kind of fatigue found in people used to dealing with other people's panic. He spoke evenly, without pressure, as if reading a weather report. He told him about the assassination attempt, about how the Alpha had survived the critical moment only thanks to Leon's donation. About how the Mafia boss's family split into several factions in his moment of weakness, each believing itself the rightful heir. Family, partners, longtime associates, All were ready to tear the spoils apart the moment the ICU monitor showed a flat line. The lawyers, he said, had had to come up with a structure that held all this together. The usual schemes failed. Too many interested parties, too many people with access to documents, safes, powers of attorney. Everyone already inside the system was tied to someone else, some old bloodline, a rival group, outside financiers. They needed someone empty, a person with no history, no property, no family, no debts or connections. Someone no one could use as a flag, a pressure point, or an excuse for a coup. The lawyer described it as pure logic, with no hint of pity. Leon listened and understood. What made him suitable wasn't that he'd saved a life. It was that before that moment, his life didn't matter to anyone. The marriage registered before surgery became the perfect tool. All assets, contracts, and signing rights were temporarily concentrated on the Axis clan leader, legal spouse. Any attempt by close relatives to dispute the arrangements now ran into not only threats and muscle, but also cold printed law. The spouse automatically gained protection as a closest relative, and all previous inheritance plans had to be rewritten with him in mind. On the surface, the picture could look almost noble. One man gives part of himself to save another. In gratitude, the second gives him a roof, treatment, legal status stronger than that of a temporary registration. Told as a magazine story, it would almost sound touching, but beneath that layer lay something else. Leon was gently but clearly made to understand that he was no longer just a donor who could be let go with an envelope. His name was screwed into the documentary system like a bolt holding a structure together. You couldn't just yank it out. If he disappeared or something happened to him, it would be grounds for a chain of lawsuits, internal strife, redistribution. And the clan did not like grounds, a shield and a chain. Both at once, a shield because his existence made outside attacks harder. No one could simply declare the leader incompetent and rewrite the business in their name, citing family interest. The spouse had legal rights to speak, to sign, to access. In theory, on paper, a chain because that same status tied Leon to a system he'd never asked for. His body, his signature, his name had become part of a circulation. As long as the marriage existed, he remained inseparable from the clan. And the marriage, as the lawyer delicately pointed out, had been concluded without an expiration date. They transferred Leon from the clinic to the mansion once he could stand more or less steadily. He didn't remember the drive. The drowsiness from the drugs and the heaviness in his side merged into thick fog. At some point, he only felt the car stop bouncing in potholes, gliding onto smooth pavement and rolling to a halt. The air outside the open door smelled of pine, wet stone, and expensive gasoline. The mansion had been built not so much as a home as a fortress wearing a mask of luxury. High walls, heavy gates, cameras at every corner, security that moved as if acutely aware that any mistake could cost more than their job. Inside, everything gleamed, marble in the hall, carpets in the corridors, paintings on the walls. But behind the decor was rigid discipline. People moved along rehearsed paths. Housekeepers slipped into side doors when the higher-ups appeared. Guards stood not just at entrances, but at points with maximum visibility. The staff spoke little, quickly, to the point. Every gesture showed a habit of taking orders without follow-up questions. When they brought Leon into this world, pale, thin, with a bandaged scar and slow steps, the mechanism shuddered a little. They looked at him in a restrained way. No open hostility, but no welcome either. For the people here, he was an unexpected element, a new rule of the game handed down from above. The boss's Omega spouse sounded like a strange joke, but the document seen by a chosen few forced them to take him seriously. One of the bodyguards escorted him to a room on the second floor. It was smaller than the one where he'd woken after the operation, but it still felt like someone else's fantasy. Large bed, wardrobe, private bathroom, window overlooking the inner courtyard. All the comforts he'd once only dreamed of. None of it made him feel calmer. He walked, bracing himself on walls, learning the new geography. The corridor to the staircase to the hall, from there to the terrace smelling of cigars and sea. The kitchen he was allowed to visit if he felt strong enough. A small sitting room where, in the evenings, several key clan members sometimes gathered. Everywhere he felt eyes on him, evaluation, curiosity. Irritated caution. Temporary, many faces seemed to say. as if the entire house agreed to treat him as an interim figure, a technical solution to be replaced by something more conventional. A marriage to a partner's daughter, perhaps, or an Omega from the Wright family. But the papers in the folder on his bedside table told a different story. The marriage had been registered under the standard framework. Joint property regime, mutual inheritance rights. No notes about time limits, no clauses about dissolution after stabilization. Everything entered into this system was, by default, long-term. At night, when the pain faded to a bearable throb, Leon lay staring into the dark, listening to the sounds of the house. Somewhere far away, on another floor, people moved. The stairs creaked, doors opened and closed. He could hear a car arriving late, guards rotating at the gate. He tried to picture a life in this world. Not as a guest, not as a temporary patient, but as part of the structure. Every step he took, every appearance in shared spaces, every word he spoke now held theoretical weight. Any offended look or careless remark could become an argument in someone's internal debate. Look, he doesn't fit, he's weak, he doesn't understand the rules. At the same time, he himself had neither the habits nor the instinct of someone raised in such a system. He didn't know how to behave at a table with people who wore holsters under their tailored jackets and held lists of other people's lives in their phones. He didn't know when silence would brand him a fool and when speaking up would be read as a challenge. The freedom he'd hoped to buy with the surgery shrank instead of expanding. Out on the street, he could at least choose where to sleep. In an underpass at a shelter, in a vacant lot. Here, the geography was bounded by orders. For now, they recommended he not leave the grounds for his own safety. Any attempt to go beyond the gate would be accompanied by at least a couple of guards. His address was now fixed in official records, and the people controlling that address expected him not to create extra risks. At the same time, the marriage really did give him protection. Even he, a man used to living with no rights, could feel it. No one could simply toss him out of the gate. They couldn't sell his contract as they sometimes sold freelancers or performers' contracts. They couldn't swap him out for a more convenient Omega without his signature. The law books contained clauses about spousal consent, property division, pressure. Even in a world where law was often just a stage prop, it still added an extra layer of armor. That same armor was also a collar. Any proper move to dissolve the union would mean war. Internal war between those who supported the current arrangement and those waiting for its weakening. External war with rivals eager to seize the moment. Leon understood that his personal wishes ranked last here. He caught himself thinking in new terms. Before, there had only ever been today, and at most, tomorrow. Beyond that lay a gray emptiness. Now words like long-term, consequences, strategy crept in. Not because he wanted them, but because others were treating him as an element affecting their strategy. Sometimes, passing a closed door, he heard the word spouse next to his name. They weren't discussing his personality or his tastes. They were discussing his status. As an object. As a factor. He had become a shield the Alpha used to keep his greedy relatives at bay. A shield that might one day be discarded once it was no longer needed. But for now, he was needed. Because it was through him that the line ran separating the clan from chaos, and at the same time, he was the chain holding him in place just as firmly. They would not let him go until it suited them. They wouldn't let him dissolve back into the city, return to shelters and street jobs. For the first time in many years, he had landed somewhere he could not just walk away from by slamming a door. The paradox was that in this double role, he was, for the first time in a long time, at least somewhat acknowledged as existing. Not as an extra mouth, not as a problem, not as a statistical unit in a homelessness report. As a human being around whom, whether he liked it or not, someone had built part of a system. That feeling frightened and drew him in at once. Like the cold of a bracelet snapping around your wrist, you can hate its chill. But you can't deny that it's a solid bracelet now, and not an invisible noose. The house they brought him to after the clinic at first seemed like a set from someone else's movie. Marble in the hall was too smooth, the lines of the staircases too straight, the shadows from the lights too precisely calculated. But the longer Leon lived there, the more he understood. The main thing about this mansion wasn't stone and wood. The main thing was how it sounded. The mansion stood on a hill from which the city below looked like a glowing stain in the distance. During the day, life boiled there as usual. Traffic jams, sirens, the hum of human voices. Up here, that noise reached the house as a distant, almost indistinguishable background that dissolved into the thick air of the garden and stone walls. At night, the lights below flickered like someone else's stories, towards which this house seemed to feel a mild contempt. Inside, everything obeyed invisible rules. Security really did know every rustle. Leon quickly realized that if he lingered too long by an unfamiliar door or changed his usual route, a heavy step would appear somewhere deep in the corridor. Not loud, without obvious threat, but with a tone clearly saying, "We noticed." Cameras built into the corners looked mute and impersonal, but behind them were living people used to matching the sound of footsteps to the image on the screen and drawing conclusions. The staff also lived by ear. The housekeepers started moving faster if the head of security's voice dropped half a tone. The cook changed the dinner menu as soon as he heard one short, dry word on the phone. The staff responsible for receiving guests learned to understand from a single call on the internal line whether the evening would be calm or tense. Leon learned to live in this space the same way he had once learned to survive on the street. Back then, he navigated by the creak of stairwell doors, by the distinctive whistle of night crowds, by the footsteps of those he needed to stay away from. The difference was only in the scenery. Instead of peeling walls, polished panels. Instead of the smell of dampness, the scent of furniture polish, expensive perfume, and cigars smoked only on certain terraces. Morning in the mansion didn't begin with an alarm clock, but with a rhythm. First, somewhere deep in the house, the equipment came to life. The quiet hum of the server room, muffled voices in the security room, the clink of porcelain in the kitchen. Then the first footsteps sounded in the hall, people carrying documents. The Alpha's office door opened and closed with a certain frequency, by which you could tell how busy the day was. The more often the handle clicked, the more there was to do. By day, the house filled with a businesslike cacophony. Not loud, but dense. Someone's restrained yes from behind a door, the low murmur of a meeting, the rustle of papers. Sometimes scraps of phrases reached Leon, numbers, street names, those names that were repeated with respect or with irritation. His own name sometimes appeared in those conversations as well, usually next to the master's name. Not in the context of feelings or household trivia, but in links like spousal status, access, cover. In the evening, the house changed its tone. If no guests were expected, the corridors emptied and footsteps became rare and confident. Somewhere downstairs, in the bar, the small sitting room, a few people gathered whose voices the walls did not drown out. Their tone carried the kind of power that didn't need shouting, for now Leon avoided those zones. He simply listened from afar, separating out by shades who spoke to the master as an equal and who hid behind respectful wording. Sometimes guests arrived. Then the house shifted into a special mode. A new smell climbed the staircase, expensive suits, someone else's cologne, someone else's confidence. In the entryway, dry politeness began, honed over years of joint deals and mutual threats. Security became more invisible, but denser. Maids moved faster than usual, trying not to cross paths with the new faces. Leon was told that on such evenings it was better for him to stay in his rooms until they sorted out the configuration. The word configuration sounded as if they were talking not about living people, but about the arrangement of pieces on a board. He obeyed, not out of obedience but out of self-preservation. He still didn't understand which exact steps would be considered correct in this house. His own role remained a strange blank between the lines. Formally, he was a spouse. The papers confirmed it. A lawyer had once dryly listed everything he was entitled to: living under this roof, access to certain rooms, financial support, participation in some decisions if the master deemed it necessary. In practice, most people around him treated him like a temporary guest who'd been granted an overly generous indulgence. The maids addressed him politely, almost pointedly so. But there was that note of cautious curiosity in their voices that people have when they expect a new piece of furniture to be replaced soon. The guards kept their distance as if practicing a new protocol, respectful, but without any attempt at closeness. People from the clan's inner circle either pretended he wasn't there at all or noted his presence with a brief nod, the way you acknowledge a new chair in an office. Leon slowly began to notice small details. For example, there wasn't a single photograph in the house where the Alpha stood next to someone clearly close to him. There were old portraits of ancestors in heavy frames, There were pictures from formal events where he shook partners' hands, stood at the opening of another complex, accepted an award from some city structure. But there was not a single frame with someone else's smile beside him. That only reinforced the feeling that his marriage did not fit into any tradition. There were no previous official partners to compare him to. Nor was there any legend that the head of the clan always formalized a union with someone for political reasons. Everything looked as if the lawyers had indeed invented a new line specifically for this crisis. Leon began to listen not only to words but also to pauses. When the security room discussed threats, his name surfaced in combinations like potential target, under guard, keep out of sight. When lawyers lingered in the hall, they let their gaze rest on him for a fraction of a second as they passed, assessing him. In their tired eyes there was no interest in the person, only in a variable: how controllable he was, how stable, how likely he was to interfere one day. The house became for him not just a place, but a coordinate system where every sound mattered. Leon understood that footsteps were listened to here not only for safety. From footsteps they guessed the master's condition, his mood. If he climbed the stairs quickly, almost without touching the rail, the house started working a little lighter. Voices were freer, the cooks allowed themselves to experiment, the guards relaxed their shoulders. If his step was heavy, slow, with long pauses, everything froze. In that rhythm, even the clink of cups in the kitchen sounded too loud. Over time, he realized that his own footsteps were being listened to as well. At first, he tried to walk quietly, as he had on the street, to blend into the shadows, not attract attention. But parquet and stone behaved differently from stairwell concrete. His light, slightly uncertain gait was restrained but still audible. And each time he changed his usual route, walked not to his room, but for example to another section of the second floor, somewhere deep inside the house there was always a response in the form of a subtle movement, a guard step, a slightly shifted chair, a barely audible crackle on the intercom. One day he stopped at the end of a corridor, staring at a closed door behind which, according to rumor, important papers were kept. He hadn't even had time to take a step forward when a figure in a gray suit slipped out from around the corner. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with such precision that there was no doubt his movement had been noticed the moment he had only thought of turning aside. "It's better not to walk here alone," came the soft, formally polite warning. Leon nodded and turned back without arguing. In this house, the walls truly had ears, but the floors did too. He started choosing safe trajectories. The route to the kitchen, where they already knew him, and sometimes even set aside a bowl of soup for him. The path to the garden, which they opened when security deemed the situation calm. The way to the room where he did rehabilitation with the doctor. Over time, these paths developed their own sound. Security, growing used to these routes, no longer reacted to them so sharply. At the same time, they instilled in him a new caution. The doctor who came to monitor his recovery spoke evenly and mercilessly. No heavy loads, no sharp temperature changes, no ignoring the first signs of fatigue. One kidney had to work for two, and his body needed time to learn to live in a new mode. It made for a strange combination. In a world where everything around him was measured in strength and readiness to push to the limit, his most important quality was now the ability to stop in time, to sit, to take a breath. He was too fragile a part of a mechanism used to running itself into the ground. Sometimes, late in the evening, he would find himself alone in one of the corridors. The house quieted, most doors closed, security moved to night posts. At those times, footsteps faded almost completely, and other sounds could be heard. The distant gurgling of the heating system, the creak of one or two old trees in the garden, someone carefully closing a window in the far wing. Leon stood in the shadows and thought that this house, like any other, was filled with life through small things. Not through status or power, but through the way ordinary things sounded in it. Footsteps, laughter, silence, the sudden ringing of a fallen spoon. The only question was whether he would remain in this symphony just a foreign random note, or whether over time he would be able to trace his own line. For now, all he could do was avoid making unnecessary sharp sounds and learn to read the rhythm by which this place lived. The house, where footsteps were listened to his as well. And far more than his right to sleep in a room with a view of the city depended on how he learned to walk through these corridors. After the operation and the move to the mansion, Leon at first thought the world had simply forgotten him. The house was too quiet, too controlled to believe in the existence of other realities. The walls kept the city noise at bay, security filtered out extra faces, and it seemed as if his whole life had shrunk to corridors, staircases, and rare visits from the doctor. But the city had ears of its own. At first, faint echoes reached Leon through the TV he almost never watched. The news briefly mentioned a complex surgery that had saved the life of a well-known businessman whose name sounded clean in official reports, untainted by dirt. No details, no mention of a donor. Just a phrase about a unique combination of factors, and, thanks to all participants in the process, the image was polished, as always. In the shadow of that image, other voices began to stir. Underground channels, anonymous forums, blogs of those who lived on the edge of what was permitted picked up the scent of blood instantly. The story of a mafia boss dragged back from the brink leaked out before the lawyers could build a solid wall of silence. Posts appeared about a strange nighttime operation in an expensive clinic, about an unknown Omega who had supposedly sold himself completely, about rumors of a marriage contract signed the same night. Leon did not seek this information out. It found him by roundabout routes. Once, he overheard a guard whispering to colleagues, quoting an anonymous channel. They wrote about a lucky guy from the streets who donated a kidney and got not only money, but also a ring on his finger. The guard's voice carried a mixture of envy, disbelief, and contempt. Another time, a maid in the kitchen was discussing with a coworker how people online argued whether the donor was even still alive or had been disposed of after surgery. The city was drawing its own versions. In some of them, he was cast as a naive victim who didn't understand what he'd gotten into. In others, an opportunistic player using the boss's illness as a chance to rise from the very bottom. Sometimes they spoke of him as a cover for more complex schemes. Supposedly, the real donors had vanished without a trace, and a pretty legend was simply hung on him. Meanwhile, in narrower circles, people began to remember a specific Leon, not a mythic one. Old acquaintances from the shelter, seeing familiar outlines of the clinic in news posts, and guessing it was about that same batch of ads on the lampposts, began asking questions. Volunteers from the soup kitchen remembered the quiet Omega who had stopped coming for dinner around the time the city started talking about the operation. Some merely retold the story out of interest. Some tried to find out whether he could be pulled back, at least for a meeting. But there were also those who saw an opportunity. Organizers of gray organ trafficking schemes irritably asked who had managed to intercept such a convenient donor. In their world, a person without family, registration, or social trace was not a miracle, but a resource. They would gladly have sold him twice if they could. Rival groups also did not stand aside. In their conversations, Leon's name surfaced in another context. Some considered him a weak spot through which pressure could be put on the Alpha. Others suspected that under the guise of a homeless Omega, a carefully prepared agent had been brought into the house. For them, his past was not cause for pity, but a map of vulnerabilities. Every thrown-out rental room, every debt, every old job could one day become a reason to tug the right string. At the same time, shadows of a different sort began to rise. People who had once kicked him out suddenly remembered they had known this Omega as soon as they learned whom he now belonged to. The former landlord of the communal flat who had thrown him onto the street under the pretext of hormonal issues felt an unpleasant knot in his stomach when he heard the surname of Leon's new spouse. A pair of old employers who had never paid him for cleaning night bars suddenly realized that this nobody could, if he wished, bring someone else's attention down on them. Some tried to soothe themselves with the thought that Leon surely didn't remember or wouldn't dare. Others, on the contrary, wanted to remind him of their existence just in case. You never know when a connection to the boss's household might come in handy. The world that had once pushed him out as a useless element was now slowly turning toward him, not out of affection, but out of calculation. Leon saw only the tip of this iceberg, but even that made his inner world tremble. He began to notice how his own biography, which he had considered dirty, dull, and of no interest to anyone, was turning into an object of intelligence gathering. Requests started coming to the house in his name. Clan lawyers dryly reported that someone claiming to be a former employer had called someone else, a distant relative, another, a neighbor from an old apartment. In most cases, these contacts were neatly cut off, but the fact itself spoke volumes. The past he had run away from onto the street was now coming back through the front door. In this upside-down world, his former grayness stopped being a shield. What had made him invisible now turned into a map of weak spots. Street connections, old establishments, shelters, all of that became a potential source of information for those wanting to reach either him or the Alpha through him. He turned that thought over in his mind every time he sat on the edge of his bed and realized he was afraid to close his eyes. It turned out that being nobody was safer than being someone whose story was suddenly considered valuable. In the world of the Mafia, nothing was forgotten, and they certainly didn't forgive either other people's mistakes or other people's weaknesses. Meanwhile, his connection with the Alpha stopped being just a line in a document. It wasn't about sudden confessions or romantic gestures. Everything was far cruder and simpler. Their bodies were physically linked. Part of what kept the other man's life going had once grown in Leon's own body. Shared vessels, shared risks, shared numbers in lab tests. Doctors spoke of compatibility, the probability of complications, of the donors' and recipients' bodies behaving like two sides of a single process. Leon listened to these dry explanations and at some point realized something simple. His health was no longer only his business. Any drastic step, any attempt to switch himself off from the system would hit not just him. Any attempt to disappear, to leave, to vanish, to annul the marriage, to run, now had not abstract but very concrete consequences. Stress, therapy failure, the risk of rejection could send the Alpha back to where they had fought so hard to drag him from. He had never thought of himself as anyone's support. His whole life he had been the one people economized on, the one they didn't count. Now it turned out that one of his kidneys had become this clan's last argument against chaos. As long as he was alive, stable, and treated, the boss's power held more firmly. Enemies couldn't say the operation had failed. Allies couldn't accuse him of irresponsibility. At some point he caught himself realizing he could no longer treat himself as expendable, even if habit pushed him that way. The irony was that the value of his life had for the first time become not an abstract idea but a clear, cold fact. If he fell, it wouldn't be only him who fell. That thought frightened and anchored him at the same time. In the evenings, sitting by the window of his room, he looked at the distant city lights and tried to figure out which was more precious. That former freedom, where he could vanish at any moment because no one needed him, or this new, strange lack of freedom where his steps were tracked. But in return, his existence had a weight it had never had before. The shadows of the past thickened not only outside, they crept up from inside, reminding him of all the times he had considered himself replaceable. Now he had to revise those convictions, and that was no easier than the healing wound in his side. The price of the life he had given turned out to be much higher than the sum in the contract. And it wasn't only those in power who had to pay it, but he himself, day after day, decision after decision, breath after breath, now linked to a stranger's heart beating somewhere in another room of this house. The evening began like many others, slowly, with a long strip of orange light over the city and a viscous silence inside the house. But by dusk, Leon felt the air change. Security spoke more briefly. The radio chatter that sometimes leaked into the corridors in broken phrases became denser, harsher. Someone was checking the cameras more often than usual. The terrace doors were closed, though the weather didn't require it. The mansion was preparing for a visit. The cars arrived without sirens or displays of force. But by the way the men at the main entrance tensed up, Leon understood. These were not friends. Another clan. Another pack, those with whom you maintain a fragile peace only as long as it's profitable. Officially, it was called diplomacy. Unofficially, everyone understood that behind polite formulas, they would be measuring each other's weak spots. Upstairs, in the big office, they were preparing the meeting room, polishing the table, setting out water, checking communications equipment. Men with a certain look in their eyes stood at the door, making it clear that few would be let inside. Leon had no place there. Formally, he was a spouse, but not a member of the clan, not a party to the old agreements. His place was a floor below, in the zone considered safe, as long as no other orders came from above. He went down to the sitting room, trying to occupy himself with the familiar. slowly walking along the windows, listening to how the city noise changed beyond the glass, taking a few careful steps across the carpet, gauging his body's response. The scar still pulled, but it no longer burned. His body was gradually accepting its new configuration, just as the house was getting used to him. He had almost calmed down when he felt another foreign rhythm. The footsteps were soft, unobtrusive, but too deliberate to be random. Someone was not going upstairs to the office, but downstairs, where everyone who listened attentively knew the Omega spouse should be at that time. Security didn't stop this person, meaning he had clearance, or authority they preferred not to question. A man in a perfectly tailored suit with a smile that never reached his eyes appeared on the sitting room threshold. When he gave a polite greeting, there wasn't a hint of embarrassment in his voice. He moved like people used to walking into other people's houses and behaving there as if at home. He introduced himself, naming his own name and clan. He spoke of personal sympathy, of wanting to get acquainted, while the upper floors were busy with business. Formally, everything looked like a courteous visit. But in his speech, Leon heard a very familiar shade, a predatory interest covered in the fabric of politeness. The conversation started with trifles: his health after surgery, how hard it was to adapt to a new life, the weather, which in this city always became a topic when it was too early to touch the real ones. Leon answered briefly, without details. He was not obliged to create comfort for a man who had not come for him. The real proposal came once the visitor was sure no one was obviously eavesdropping. His words were careful. Not a single direct hint at a crime. Only vague phrasing about how every person has a right to freedom. How forced marriages were not a life sentence. How sometimes reasonable people helped each other part ways so that no one was left with nothing. Between the lines, concrete things flickered. The possibility of legally contesting the union, having it recognized as concluded under pressure. A willingness to provide lawyers, housing, money, offers that, for the Leon of yesterday with his filthy shelter mattress, would have sounded like a ticket to a miracle. "You can get out of this marriage if you want to," came almost straight. Only instead of can, he used the softer have the right. Instead of we will buy your exit, we will help you get settled. After a while, a second conversationalist appeared with a different intonation. Less smooth, more direct, with the smell of cheap tobacco that even expensive cologne couldn't hide. He spoke about how every ally must have a price, about how the signature of an Omega who legally holds an entire clan together is worth a lot, and that if Leon ever wanted to use his role not only as a chain but also as a source of profit, it would be smarter to do it with those who knew how to count. Here, actual sums surfaced, neatly buried in hypothetical scenarios, but concrete enough for the mind to picture the numbers. Enough to never go back to shelters, to buy out not one, but several lives like his old one. Leon listened and felt not only fear rise in him, but also anger. Not at them. They were logical. In their world, everything had a price: organs, alliances, surnames, cities. They had come to him because they had seen a new price appear where there used to be zero. They were operating by their rules. The anger rose at himself, at the former self, who, not so long ago, would have been ready to take any offer of money and escape. At the one who had gone to the clinic clutching that flyer like a life ring, without looking at whom the ring would tie him to. He remembered those nights when his life really had neither legal nor emotional value. When death in an alleyway would not have been a tragedy, but the expected end of a statistical line. Back then, any offer, even from the worst kind of predators, could have seemed like a chance. Now, everything was different. His name stood next to the alphas in documents. His health was monitored like an important parameter in a complex system. In this house, there were people used to seeing his appearance in the kitchen, not as random, but as part of a schedule. The nurse who didn't mind checking his stitches one more time. The cook who set aside softer food for him on days when the pain grew stronger. The guard who had once simply closed the door in an uninvited guest's face without asking permission from above. They were not his family in the usual sense. Their concern was part of their jobs, part of a system where everything was tied to the master of the house. But that didn't change the fact. Here his existence produced reactions. Here his footsteps were heard and factored in. He felt the difference acutely. Where he had been nobody, he truly could have disappeared for any sum. Here, his disappearance would be an event. A pretext, a trigger, the beginning of a chain whose consequences he couldn't even fully imagine. The choice these envoys were offering him was not simply leave or stay. It was an attempt to turn him once again into an instrument, into a lever that could be intercepted and turned against the one to whom he was now bound, by organ and by law. In that realization, a new word appeared for the first time. Side. Until now, Leon had thought of himself as an observer, a man tossed across a chasm from one world into another without being asked. He tried not to take up space, not to give anyone a reason. But now it became clear. There was no neutral point in this system. Any "I just want to disappear" would be counted as a move, in someone's favor. He remembered lying under the white operating theater light and thinking he was giving up part of himself to buy a chance at a different life. Back then, he had viewed the deal only one way, between himself and his own future. Now the chain was longer. It included people, this house, the clan, enemies, allies. His decision about whose side he was on pulled too many things along with it. The hostile offers that sounded as if they were about freedom were, in reality, calling him back to a place where he would again be an object. Yes, with money. Yes, with legal backing. But still an object in someone else's plans, not a subject of his own choices. Realizing that, Leon suddenly understood that for the first time in a long time, the thought of the word "we" didn't trigger an automatic recoil in him. That "we" didn't ask to be spoken aloud. He wasn't ready to say it yet. But he already felt there was a side he was leaning toward. The house that listened to footsteps, the people whose safety was partly tied to his breathing. The alpha, whose heart was beating thanks to the organ once taken from his body on an operating table. The freedom outsiders were offering him looked like thin ice, a beautiful surface with cold water and the teeth of those who would always see him only as a valuable resource beneath it. The lever that unexpectedly ended up in his hands could either be sold to the first who named a price, or kept and used for the first time in his life, not only for his own survival, but to try to change the rules around him. By evening, while the guests were still upstairs, Leon already knew what he would answer those who came again. Even if he didn't say it immediately, even if he wrapped it in polite phrases, inside the decision had already been made. The house lived in a state of constant threat, but you eventually got used to this noise as you would to highway hum outside a window. Leon learned to distinguish ordinary tension, the background, working kind, from that particular sticky chill that came when something was going wrong. On days when cars without insignia pulled up to the gates, security grew harsher, corridors quieter, and the air seemed to grow heavier. After the diplomatic visit from the other clan, that chill did not dissipate. It stayed, hiding in corners, in pauses between phrases, in the slightly sharper tone of the head of security. Everyone pretended the talks had gone well, but Leon felt that someone had left dissatisfied. Someone had not gotten what they had expected. The answer did not come from outside. Inside the clan, there had long been a man used to standing close to power. Not in first place, but close enough to warm himself in its light and a hope one day to step out of the shadows. He knew the roots, the habits, the patterns. He knew whom you could buy, whom you could intimidate, whom to feed with accidental errands so they would grow used to dependency. Leon's appearance had ruined his carefully calibrated geometry, where he had spent years earning trust by reporting, taking hits, handling matters. Suddenly there was a man from the street. A homeless Omega, a former donor, had suddenly gotten a status he had never had and never could have. Not just the role of a useful tool, a legal marriage. A line in the documents upon which neither the old games of loyalty nor the old arrangements had any hold. To this man, it all looked like a mockery of fate. His patience, his cautious strategy, his willingness to remain second all his life, everything had been devalued by one decision the boss had made on an operating table. And the only conclusion he came to was simple. The Omega was a mistake that needed correcting. He wasn't foolish enough to act openly. A direct attack on the legal spouse would have been public suicide. But he had access to what connected the two bodies. The mansion's medical wing was a world of its own. It smelled of sterilizing solutions, plastic, and metal there. People worked who considered themselves above clan games. Doctors, lab technicians, specialists. They followed rules and protocols, but any protocol could be hijacked if you knew where a human hand touched it. At first, it all looked like minor changes to the schedule. A pill Leon was used to taking after breakfast was once brought in the evening. An IV was replaced with a medication of similar composition, explained as optimization. Gaps appeared in the monitoring schedule. The doctor, who had previously been reservedly talkative, became more curt, sometimes avoiding his eyes. Leon didn't catch the pattern immediately. His body was still recovering. Pain was a usual background. But after a few days, he noticed his familiar pattern of sensations had shifted. The pain in his side became wrong, not a pulling ache, but a burning, cutting one that flared up suddenly. A strange weakness appeared, unlike normal fatigue, as if something inside him was resisting the very fact of existing. He had spent years learning to ignore his body, because street life left no time for the luxury of listening to every ache. But precisely because of that, he recognized dangerous signals better than most. When a homeless person develops an inflammation, he either reacts immediately or doesn't wake up. One night, Leon woke up to his heart pounding unevenly and his breathing hitting a rigid wall. He lay in the dark, feeling his blood pulsing in soft waves, but sharp cold breaks had appeared in those waves. A single word he had heard from the nephrologist surfaced immediately: rejection. Panic surged at once, but another habit came up above it, the habit of analyzing. He ran through the last few days in his mind. The changed medication times, the new nurse who had appeared as a substitute, the slightly harsh smell from the solution they had infused yesterday. That strange flicker in one staff member's eyes when they said the lab results would go to the clan's lawyers. If rejection truly began, 2 people would suffer. His own body trying to get rid of the foreign kidney, and the man that kidney had saved. Any serious complication in the donor meant a threat to the recipient, a disrupted therapy chain, revisiting treatment plans. Enemies who wanted to hit the boss had found the thinnest way in. This isn't right, flashed in his mind. He got up, clinging to the side of the bed, and half-blindly made it to the call button. The voice he used to explain to the night nurse that something was wrong came out hoarse, but carried a stubbornness that was hard to dismiss. He didn't ask for painkillers. He demanded a doctor and tests. They woke the doctor in the middle of the night. The man was annoyed and tired, but professional enough not to ignore such symptoms. They drew blood, ran an EKG, checked sensitivity around the scar, politely said, "This may just be stress. You've overexerted yourself." Leon looked at their faces and could see who actually believed that and who was saying it because it was simpler. In the morning, the results came back. The numbers sat on the boundary, not a disaster, but already a warning. One marker that should have stayed steadily low had begun to creep up. That meant there was some factor in the regimen provoking an immune response. Then, those who made money not just on weapons and contracts, but on information, stepped in. Analysts used to mapping supply routes and corporate connections applied their methods to the medical wing. They checked shifts, compared schedules, pulled camera footage. They saw which days and under whose duty the medication was changed. They found a strange tiny delay in the delivery of a batch of drugs that should have come straight in, but had inexplicably passed through extra hands. The picture assembled slowly but relentlessly. Against the backdrop of habitual loyalty and routine work from the medical staff, one person stood out. A junior employee previously barely noticed because he was always on call, always willing to cover someone else's shift, always smiling when asked to stay longer. It turned out that this man had been in contact with people on the other side of the gates for some time. He fed them small bits, schedules, lists of visiting specialists, occasional info about the boss's health. At first, he was paid for it, then blackmailed. At some point, they asked for a small favor in exchange for a chance to vanish from the city. The small favor was replacing just a few vials. Not to kill immediately, that would have raised too many questions. To start a process that could be blamed on natural risk. To trigger problems in both the Alpha and his Omega that would weaken the clan from within. They uncovered the scheme precisely because Leon had insisted, "Something is wrong. This is not just pain." Had he, as before, endured it, written it off as fatigue and what you expect after surgery, the enemies would have had more time. The internal investigation was harsh. The smell of fear was back in the house. People were questioned, archives pulled, phones checked. The suspect was dragged out of his usual bustle, and his neat mask fell off almost at once. Under the pressure of numbers, recordings, and facts, he began to talk. For the clan, this betrayal was a cold shower. For too long, everyone had believed the main danger was outside, in other houses and offices. But the blow had come from someone who wore their uniforms, ate from their kitchen, walked their corridors for years. For Leon, it was a turning point. For the first time, he saw how his sense of his own body and timing could outpace any equipment. His insistence was not a habit of complaining, but a protective factor. His voice, which had never mattered to anyone before, was now what stopped a slow, almost invisible murder. The Alpha reacted predictably and irrevocably. The circle around him was cleaned out. Some were reassigned, some removed, some placed under special scrutiny. The house again resembled a besieged fortress. More checks, fewer casual visits, stricter rules. But in these changes, Leon now saw not only walls, but lines he had been woven into. His name now came up when security was discussed. They explained which symptoms he must not ignore, which readings he had the right to demand be checked immediately. The doctor who had once spoken to him at a distance began asking about his subjective sensations, not just looking at graphs. He had stopped being just a target convenient to strike through. He had become part of the second line of defense. It didn't make his life easier. The responsibility weighed on him. Now, every strange ache in his side, every offbeat breath reminded him, if he kept silent, it wouldn't only be him who suffered. But along with that weight came another feeling he hadn't been able to name for a long time. Significance. In the place where his existence had once been erasable by a stranger's single decision, it was now his attentiveness and his willingness to speak aloud about what was frightening that kept the house on its feet. And in that, paradoxically, there was more freedom than in any of the hostile freedoms recently offered to him beyond the gates. The legal war didn't start with a court summons, but with a barely noticeable change in the background. First, there were strange calls to the landline of the house office, which the secretary marked with dry little notes. Then came letters with official seals, neatly stacked into a separate folder. Finally, the day came when even security, long used to threats in the most literal sense, understood. This time, the hit would come on paper. When it became clear that direct assassination attempts and quiet interference with therapy could not break the system, the enemies did what they had always known how to do best. They turned to the law. Not to submit to it, but to use it as yet another tool. Complaints and petitions began to pour into various agencies. In some of them, Leon was presented as a victim of coercion, a poor Omega whom a criminal clan had forced onto the operating table and then deceitfully registered as the boss's spouse. In others, he was painted as part of a fraudulent scheme. Supposedly, he himself had joined the conspiracy to gain access to money and influence. In a third set, the emphasis was on his past: homelessness, shelters, episodes where he donated blood and plasma in violation of formal protocols just to survive. On the desks of officials and judges appeared his old applications from shelters, copies of medical records from free clinics, police reports on raids in abandoned buildings where people like him used to sleep. Every document that had once just been a trace of his fall was now turned into a building block of accusation. From them, they tried to construct the image of a man incapable of making conscious decisions. The key attack line was simple and effective. Leon was declared legally incapacitated at the moment he signed the contract. Unstable omega hormones, chronic fatigue, health risks, lack of permanent housing and support, all of this was presented as proof that he could not truly assess the consequences of donation and especially of marriage. Therefore, the marriage should be declared invalid. At the same time, people in expensive suits appeared on the horizon, claiming they were acting in the interests of the victim. Lawyers Leon had never seen filed papers in his name, trying to initiate proceedings to dissolve the marriage without his direct involvement. Their petitions used all the right words: protection, freedom, the right to an independent life. In reality, they cared about one thing: to free the boss's surname from a stranger's signature and open the way for those who had long been waiting for a convenient pretext to revise the structure of inheritance. For Leon, this became a new kind of nightmare. If before, threats came in the form of rustling footsteps at night or a strange taste in his medication, now they hid in legal formulas he could barely understand. Concepts like incapacitation, challenging a transaction, annulment of marriage, sounded like a different language in which people in robes and with crested seals were deciding his fate. For the first time in his life, he had to step out of the safe shadow of the mansion, not for a hospital, but for rooms that smelled of paper, coffee from vending machines, and other people's ambition. Closed hearings, where he was brought not in handcuffs, but under the close watch of security, were no less oppressive than interrogations. Here, they did not look at him as a living lever of pressure, but as a convenient piece in someone else's theory of saving the weak. He sat at the table under the dull hum of the air conditioner and felt the eyes on him. The judge, tired but attentive, noted every word he uttered. Representatives of different agencies were taking notes, matching his testimony to the thick folders in front of them. The lawyer, introduced as his defender, repeated smooth versions in a polished voice, versions no one had ever discussed with Leon himself. For the first time, Leon realized how much easier it had been to remain silent when nothing depended on his silence. Out on the street, keeping quiet protected him from unnecessary blows. Here, silence could become a signature under a sentence. He heard one of the lawyers say, almost tenderly, a poor Omega who had not known what he was doing, a poor donor misled and exploited. There was no compassion in his tone, only satisfaction. This version suited everyone except Leon himself. If it was accepted, his life would once again become a thing that could be moved from one folder to another. When they gave him the floor, his mouth at first felt glued shut from the inside. There was the taste of hospital chlorine in his throat, the memory of the mask on his face, of the darkness of anesthesia. Part of him wanted to do what he was used to, nod, agree to any ready-made wording just to make it all end faster, but other images surfaced in his mind. The staircase of the mansion he had climbed, gripping the banister, careful hands laying out his pills according to schedule. The doctor's quiet voice explaining how they would now live with one organ between two bodies. The Alpha's hard but honest gaze when he listened to Leon's story about other people's offers of freedom. I am not a victim who must be saved at any cost, flashed inside him. He started speaking. Not beautifully, not in legal language, in his own rough, uneven, sometimes stumbling words. He told them how he had seen the flyer on the lamppost, how he had weighed the sum against the risks. He did not deny his desperation, did not try to present his motives as noble. He admitted frankly that he went in for surgery for money because at the time he believed his life was worth very little. But he added that he understood what he was doing, understood he might not wake up. He explained that he had seen the documents before signing. Yes, not all the legal wording was clear to him. Yes, no one had explained the political consequences in full. But he had been told about a technical union, not about forged signatures. No one held his hand and forced it across the page. The hardest part was admitting out loud the thing he himself feared, that after the operation, when he woke up in a strange room, he could have left if he had truly wanted to. He could have tried to run, could have accepted the help of those who promised to get him out of the Mafia's claws. But he did not go. He stayed. Consciously. The choice he made after enduring anesthesia and pain was even more important than the one he had made putting his name on the contract. Some officials listened to him with mild boredom. Their eyes held the usual skepticism, a street Omega talking about freedom inside clan walls. But there were other looks too, more intent with flickers of doubt. People who had seen enough cases knew that the most convenient versions rarely lined up fully with the truth. By the time the legal attacks reached their peak, the house had built its own little army on this front. The clan's senior lawyer, exhausted by dirty schemes, saw in this case a chance to find out whether the law could work if you did not start by trying to circumvent it. A young attorney, an Omega with an excellent education and a broken career, took Leon's story as a personal challenge. To prove that a weak social status was not the same as a weak will. The doctor responsible for his rehabilitation prepared reports detailing his clarity of mind, both at the time of his decisions and now. Even security, usually far from the nuances of civil law, ended up involved. They brought in small but telling things, camera footage showing Leon freely moving around the house after surgery, arguing with nurses, demanding changes to his regimen, behaving not like a cowed hostage, but like a person gradually finding his voice. Those details shattered the picture of a fully controlled victim. The defense line was built not on the myth of great love, as in a TV drama, and not on a fairy tale about a mafia boss who suddenly turned saint. It rested on something more solid, on the fact that two people, each for his own reasons, had chosen a strange union in which safety, power, blood, and necessity were all mixed together, and that the destruction of this union at the initiative of third parties would not bring freedom, but a new wave of chaos. For Leon, the hardest thing was learning not to be ashamed of his past when they dragged it into the light and laid it out point by point. Every time the opposing lawyer spoke the words shelter, violation of clinic regulations, episodes of antisocial behavior, he felt the old sticky wave of shame rising. He wanted to sink under the table, to disappear from that room, but each time he reminded himself that his biography was no longer just a list of failures. It was a trajectory he had broken himself in the moment he said, "I am staying." And if he now allowed others to rewrite that story into a convenient script about eternal helplessness, he would erase everything he had already managed to do. Gradually, he began to answer differently, not apologizing, but explaining. Yes, he had lived in shelters because they were the only places that offered a bed. Yes, he had donated blood more often than allowed because the choice had been between that and starving. Yes, he had violated regulations when they demanded that he wait in line for hours while he was fainting from weakness. Those admissions did not turn him into an ideal witness, but they made him real. And in the dry space of the legal front, that turned out to be unexpectedly powerful. The enemies did not give up. They launched new lawsuits, roped in activists invented for the cameras. On air, pseudo-experts appeared, earnestly warning how dangerous it was to leave a fragile Omega in the clutches of criminals. But as Leon increasingly came to the hearings himself and spoke, instead of letting others speak for him, the pauses between each new attack grew longer. For the clan, the legal war became just another front alongside the street and the finances. For Leon, it turned into a strange exam in adulthood. Here, he could not hide behind someone else's back, not even behind the back of an alpha with a heavy name. Every motion granted in their favor, every petition to declare him incapacitated that the court rejected, was not only the result of the lawyer's work, but also of the fact that he kept stepping forward and saying, "I understand what they did to me, and I choose to remain in this life on my own terms." And the longer this war over the surname dragged on, the clearer it became. Leon's name was no longer an empty line to which any convenient role could be attached. It had become a point around which arguments, schemes, and strategies had to be built, and that, strangely enough, gave him a sense of footing no worse than the mansion walls on the hill. The night began like many others, almost deceptively calm. The mansion was breathing evenly. Downstairs, the guard shift was changing posts, the dishwasher hummed lazily in the kitchen, the climate control system muttered quietly as it drove air through hidden shafts. Leon slept lightly, as he always had since the operation. His body had grown used to its new configuration, but the inner fear of sudden pain still would not let him go. He did not wake from a sound. He woke from a smell and the density of the air. A second before the floor shuddered from a muffled blow, something in the house changed, as if someone had injected a foreign, sharp current into a flat line of tension. The smell of metal, sweat, and cheap gun oil used to clean illegal weapons seeped through the conditioned cleanliness. A moment later came the first real signal, a short, dull pop somewhere near the service wing. It was not a door slamming, not a dropped tray. That was how suppressed shots sounded in a narrow corridor. The internal security system answered with an alarm, but it did not howl through the whole house. Only green and red indicator lights flared in the seams between ceiling and walls. Leon sat up in bed, his heart slamming painfully and sending a stab into his side. His body tried to call up its old street reflex. Lie back down, wait it out, pretend you were just a shadow here. But he no longer had the luxury of being a shadow. In this house, his name stood on those very documents that, as he had already understood, any hands planning a coup would reach for. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and drew in a breath. His legs were trembling. The scar ached, but the pain was familiar, predictable. Something else was worse. The feeling that this time the strike was aimed not only at the alpha. If the enemies had come not through the courts and not through medication schemes, they had decided to burn everything at once. People, archives, compromising material, inconvenient witnesses. The corridor met him with muffled chaos. In the distance, closer to the service entrance, he heard shouting, heavy footsteps, dull thuds against walls. Security's radio chatter hissed in short commands. Somewhere someone barked, "Downstairs!" And then the frequency was filled with static. Leon could have turned toward the internal stairway leading to the safe room. He knew how to reach it. They had explained the protocol to him in case of an assault. The Omega spouse goes under protection, the door is sealed, the professionals take it from there. His body almost automatically shifted in that direction. But in the same second, another image flashed up. The assault team bursting in not only to the bedrooms. They would want more than living targets. They would want the rooms holding what could not be burned in a simple fire: archives, data carriers, safes with contracts. Including the ones about his marriage. Over months in the house, Leon had learned the layout as well as the guards. He knew that the service entrance led through a corridor to a small lift, and from there to the technical rooms and the spaces where electronic and paper copies of parts of the clan's financial and legal history were stored. He knew that one side door, unremarkable from the outside, led to the archive where folders with their union's papers lay alongside recent decisions and correspondence with lawyers. He swore under his breath. Shit, if they get to the archive. Instead of the stairs, he moved forward, in the direction he shouldn't have been pulled toward. Breathing was hard, his heart beat in the scar, every step took effort. But at the same time, something very old, something from the streets switched on inside him, the ability to read space from scraps of sound. The footsteps of the attackers were different from those of the house's own people. The intruders walked with slightly wider, heavier strides, not taking into account the building's peculiarities. They lacked the habit of avoiding the one creaky board near the turn or catching a door so it didn't slam against the stopper. They were in a hurry. That alone gave them away where cameras might not catch them. Leon cut into a side corridor, the one leading to the server room and the archive. At floor level, tiny indicators were already flashing. The system, having registered a breach at another entrance, was shifting into lockdown mode. But doors could not be sealed instantly. Their own people might still be inside, otherwise they would be locked in with the attackers. One of the guards almost ran into him. A big beta, usually silent, was pale now but focused. Gun in hand, radio spitting orders. "Safe room," he snapped to Leon. "Now." "Archive," Leon forced out, pointing toward the right corridor. His voice sounded strange but firm. "They will go there. If they find..." The guard's gaze lingered on him for a fraction of a second. This was not the kind of situation where you wanted to debate strategy with an Omega in loungewear. But he had worked here long enough to know this man did not talk for nothing. He had seen Leon in the middle of legal battles, had seen how precisely he knew which documents kept the clan afloat. "There are already 2 posted there," the beta replied curtly. "But that is not enough if the breach comes from that side." Leon felt his instincts fighting inside him. Step aside and let the clan logic take over. Let those responsible decide. Go hide as protocol dictated. And another, new instinct that had taken shape sharply in the months when he had learned to say, "I am staying." The instinct to protect not only himself, but what gave weight to his choice. "I know how to cut off access," he said, feeling his stomach go cold at his own words. "The server room. The backup copies are there. If they get to the paper rooms but not the system, we still have a chance. If it is the other way around, the same. They must not get both." The guard swore quietly. Gunfire sounded again in the corridor, closer now. Somewhere a door banged, someone shouted sharply, a voice was cut off, the decision was made on the run. The beta shoved a small bunch of keycards into Leon's hand. "These and one more door," he explained briefly. "If you make it there, hit the emergency lockdown. Seal the whole wing even if our people are inside. I will sort it out later, and move." "Got it?" Leon nodded. "Got it." He did not run. Trying to sprint in his state would have been foolish. But he moved faster than usual, almost gliding over the smooth floor. Around the turn, the corridor had a different sound. Short, sharp commands, pounding footsteps, dull blows of bodies hitting walls. The intruders were close. The server room was at the end of a narrow passageway, a small, plain door with only a reader panel. Leon pressed the card to it, his fingers shaking. 1 second, an eternity. Then the lock clicked dryly. Inside, it was cool. Racks of equipment hummed in a steady, almost soothing bass. In another state, that noise might have calmed him. Predictable, structured, with no hidden threats. Now he could hear only what could be lost. On the wall next to the main power panel, there was a small button under a clear plastic cover. Emergency sector lockdown. They had shown it to him once in passing during a general briefing. Press only in case of extreme threat and understand that along with the enemy, it would trap their own people beyond that line. Leon inhaled, braced one hand on a rack, and lifted the cover with the other. He hesitated for a second. A thought flashed up. What if our people are in there? What if that tech who patiently answered your questions at night is running this way right now? Outside, a sound set the priorities straight, a heavy explosion that shook him to the bone. Somewhere below, near the service entrance, something had given way. The house shuddered, the lights blinked out for a moment, then came back on in backup mode. The alarm shrilled thinner, faster. Too late for doubts, he told himself, and pressed. Somewhere deep in the building, an invisible wave rolled out. The door locks in the sector clicked almost simultaneously, cutting off corridors. Steel shutters slid out of the walls, blocking passages. Nothing changed in the server room itself except for one thing. Access from outside was now sealed. To reach this place, the attackers would have to practically destroy part of the house. He stood there, feeling his muscles tremble from tension. With each second, the pain in his side grew sharper, his breath shorter. But under that physical noise, something else was there. A clear sense. He had done what needed doing. Back in the corridor, he saw a shadow flicker at the far edge of his vision. An outsider. A figure moving too abruptly to be one of their own, with that particular confidence of someone used to taking foreign spaces by storm. Their eyes met for just a heartbeat. Leon instinctively stepped back toward another door, the one that led toward the paper archive. The clash did not happen there. Security made it in time. Several of their own, armed and furious, burst from a side passage and intercepted the intruders at the turn. A short, brutal fight flared, gunshots mixing with grunts and the metallic clatter of weapons on tile. Leon pressed himself against the wall and covered his head with his hands. Not because he was ready to die, but because he understood perfectly how useless he would be in that kind of fight. His section of the front was where the walls, doors, and security systems were, and he had just held it. Time broke into fragments, shouts. The squeal of shoes on the floor, the smell of gunpowder and blood. Then, a heavy, draining lull when only the groans of the wounded and short commands remained in the air. When they found him, he was sitting on the floor, slid down against the wall, pale and shaking. His scar throbbed as if it had been torn open again. The guard who had given him the cards crouched down next to him to make sure he was intact. "What the hell did you do?" he exhaled, glancing at the panel on the wall glowing red with the lockdown status. His voice was not scolding, but something else, halfway between relief and shock. "Shut it down," Leon answered briefly. He had no energy for more. Later, once the house had finally been cleared of intruders, the wounded evacuated, and the bodies carried out in black bags, the picture of that night began to come together. The first wave of attackers had indeed gotten further than usual. There had been internal leaks, sold-out floor plans. They knew exactly where to head, the archive and the server room. But the moment Leon activated the lockdown, the sector turned into a capsule. The attackers got stuck in the corridors between the shutters, where security met them. Some of the documents they had planned to destroy were already on their way to temporary safes, precisely because Leon had managed to warn the people in charge of the archive and send them along detours. The server room remained untouched. The very thing the whole action was meant to take from them went to no one. For many in the house, this was a shock. They had been prepared for the Omega spouse to be a vulnerability, a lever, a weak spot. They had factored him into evacuation routes, into security schemes, into legal documents. But few had seriously expected that in the moment of direct threat, he would not only avoid becoming a burden, but would close the gap the professionals had not had time to see. After the fight, the mansion for a while resembled a hive whose routine had been violently disturbed. People walked faster than usual, spoke louder than was customary. Every rustle still held an echo of panic. Leon was, according to all protocols, sent back to the doctors. They scolded him for overexertion, for not taking care of himself at all. But the tone of those scoldings was different. There was none of the old irritation that usually accompanies the hassle of dealing with a difficult relative. There was something like respect there, awkward and therefore especially honest. In the days that followed, as the smoke settled, those changes showed even more. People who had previously looked at him as an accidental attachment to the surname began to let their eyes linger. Guards, passing him, could give him a brief nod like the nod meant for someone who had held the line with them. One of the lawyers, normally too busy to spare him an extra word, stopped and said dryly, "Without your lockdown, we would be signing very different papers right now." But the main change was not in the reactions of others. The main thing was how Leon now saw the house. The mansion stopped being just someone else's fortress where he lived by necessity. After the night of the assault, it became a place whose defense he had directly taken part in. The rooms where the servers hummed, the corridors where the shutters had slammed down, the wall he had slid down in relief, all of it was fixed in his memory as places where he had not been superfluous, but necessary. He still remained an omega in a world where alphas and weapons decided everything. His body was still weaker than any fighter's. The scar in his side still ached as a reminder of how fragile his physical shell was. But that night, the mansion that had grown used to listening to the boss's footsteps truly heard the footsteps of his spouse for the first time, and did not ignore them. And for Leon, that mattered more than any official certificate or formal commendation. In the moment when the house held against the hit, he did not turn out to be extra. He was the one who, in the critical second, closed the door. For a long time after the night of the assault, the house sounded different. Even when the smashed windows had long since been replaced, the blood wiped away, and the broken plaster cut off and painted over, a barely noticeable aftertaste of gunpowder and tension lingered in the air. The mansion had survived the strike, but it had changed, like a body after surgery, when the scar has already healed, but the memory of pain still sits under the skin. The rhythm slowly returned. Morning briefings, daytime meetings, occasional guests, night patrols. Only now the schedule always took into account one more variable many had preferred to ignore before. The marriage that had started as a cynical legal insurance had survived a trial by fire and steel. That night it proved effective not in the documents but in practice. The union that had been considered a temporary shield had turned into a foundation around which new calculations had to be built. Leon felt the difference first of all in the way they spoke of him when they thought he did not hear. The condescending note was gone from the guards' voices when they mentioned his name in reports. The lawyers stopped using the word technical when discussing his status. Even the doctors, scolding him for overexertion, now spoke not of a complicated patient, but of a man without whom the house that night might have lost not only people but its foothold in the law. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about the word home as something other than a temporary shelter. Until then, his whole life had been divided into points where he could get through the night without getting a knife in the ribs: a basement, a stairwell, a bunk in a shelter, a hospital cot in a cheap clinic. Even the luxurious room in the mansion had at first been just another temporary burrow for him, only with soft pillows and thick curtains. He had always kept in mind the thought that they could pull him out of it tomorrow and dump him by the door with the same indifference with which someone had once removed his things from that room in the communal flat. After the assault, that thought stopped being the only one. The house had shown that it depended on him no less than he depended on it. That was unfamiliar and frightening, but it became the starting point for a new movement. He began to claim the space as his, not with ostentatious gestures, but in a quiet omega way, changing the world through small things. First, his room began to fill with things that previously never stayed with him longer than a couple of weeks. A pair of battered books he had picked up from a bargain crate near the subway, which he had carried with him even into the shelter. No one threw them out or replaced them with glossy volumes and expensive bindings. On the table appeared an old music player with headphones that had outlived more owners than some apartments, and a box of loose, crumpled sheet music. He still could not play like a proper musician, but sometimes he put the small keyboard in front of him and pressed the keys until the chaos of sounds turned into something like a simple, stubborn melody. Then came the corridor's turn. One long wall, once covered in bland, classic-style paintings, gradually became a living ribbon. Photos appeared there, not only of the boss at business functions, but of moments after the assault, the security team in front of the restored entrance, the cook with a bandaged arm and a tired but honest smile, the nurse laughing at someone's joke. Someone suggested removing them as unnecessary emotionality, But the Alpha, flipping through the selection, left them and even ordered proper frames. For the first time, the house officially acknowledged that it contained not only roles and functions, but people. For Leon, the Alpha himself was slowly becoming not only a threat or his sole shield from the outside world. For a long time, he had seen him mainly as the man around whom schemes, blood, power, and risk all spun. The man whose life he had saved with his own kidney, whose name he had previously heard in news reports and alleyway whispers. Now another dimension was added to that image. He noticed how the Alpha, used to constructing alliances for advantage, had himself become a hostage of their alliance. Not in the sense of chains and obligations, he could handle those. In the sense that over the course of the struggle, this marriage had ceased to be a pure scheme. In their rare but honest clashes of gaze, there was too much that did not fit into the language of clan contracts. Leon saw how hard it was for this man to admit his own vulnerability, even in gestures rather than words. A shirt not fully buttoned after a sleepless night, a report left on Leon's table with the very paragraphs he used to pay attention to underlined. A short, almost inaudible breath of relief when he was told the Omega's lab tests were normal. All of that was a kind of language that Leon, long trained to read subtext, understood no worse than he understood medical printouts. The world outside remained the same. Dangerous, cynical, ruled by those who were used to counting people by units and lives by percentages of profit. The old families were still building combinations in which any union was evaluated through the lens of benefit. They tried to calculate how long this marriage would last, what bonuses it would bring, what risks it would create, and still hoped that one day they would be able to pull the right lever and break the structure. There was almost always one parameter missing from their equations: the strength of a person who had been told for years that he was expendable and who had suddenly stopped believing it. By this time, Leon's story had already begun to sprout rumors. In shelters and cheap bars, they told tales of a homeless Omega who gave up a kidney and woke up married to the boss. Some retold it as a horror story about what the rich do to the poor when given too much power. Others, as a crooked but still hope-tinged anecdote. If the world is so absurd, sometimes even the most broken path might lead not into a pit but at least onto a ledge. Echoes of these legends sometimes reached the mansion, through offhand conversations between cooks and suppliers, through snippets of phrases in reports, through the nervous laughter of guards recalling another meme born online. Leon listened and suddenly understood that somewhere out there, beyond the high fences, his life was already turning into someone else's story. Tragic in some mouths, comical in others. But in both versions, it was presented as something that had happened to him. He could not control what people said in the streets, but he could control how he himself would tell his story from now on, at least to himself. He began to allow himself a small luxury, thinking of the future not as a black void, but as a set of possible lines. He did not build castles in the air. He did not imagine a world without clans and guns. But somewhere between daily injections, scar checks, rare trips to a private clinic for tests, and evenings in his room where stubborn tunes were born on the keys, he started to feel that his life was no longer reduced to being a donor base and a legal construct. Sometimes late at night, when the house was finally quiet, Leon went to one of the distant halls where a real heavy grand piano stood, brought there once for rare receptions. No official guests had played it in a long time. Its lacquered lid gathered only dust, and the taut strings longed for work. He sat down, stretched his legs out, carefully bracing his side against the soft edge, and opened the instrument. At first, his fingers trembled, missing familiar intervals, but after a few minutes, when his body remembered the rhythm, the sound grew steadier. He did not play well-known pieces. He did not try to prove to himself that he could play the right way. Instead, he simply let whatever had built up over the day translate into sound. Sometimes it came out as a rough, jagged pattern, like banging on garbage can lids in an alley. Sometimes, a heavy, almost meditative line that recalled the hum of machines in intensive care. Sometimes, a strangely light melody, like the house's breath after a wind, that made something inside him loosen a little. In those moments, he felt especially sharply one simple thing. Everything that had been done to him before, the shelters, the clinics, the cheap contracts, Even this operation with a marriage attached had been attempts to turn him into an instrument in someone else's score. In other hands, he was supposed to be a source of profit, a blackmail lever, a spare organ for someone more important. But here, in this strange house that should not have existed for people like him, he had, for the first time, the right to choose the melody. Yes, within tight constraints. Yes, at constant risk. Yes, under the gaze of those calculating whether he was profitable or not. But still, to choose. The right to decide whether he would remain a piece moved across a board or become someone who at least set the tone for his own moves. He understood their story would not become a fairy tale with a guaranteed happily ever after. The lawsuits were not over yet. The enemies had not laid down their arms, and his body kept reminding him of the price of every mistake with a dull ache in his side. And yet, in the depths of this complicated, non-linear life, he had finally gained something he had never had before, the feeling that his story belonged to him. And if somewhere out there, beyond the mansion walls, someone is staring at a flyer on a lamppost just as he once did, thinking their life is worth nothing, perhaps the mere fact that such an impossible house exists will already be a faint but real signal. Even if they have written you off as expendable, you still have a chance to become the center of your own melody. If the viewer has listened to this story to the end, it means there was a note in it that resonated with their own experience. The channel BL Story of Love will continue to tell stories about those who were considered the weakest link and became the center of an entire world. To avoid missing the next forbidden BL story, the viewer should subscribe, leave a like, and treat their own life carefully, even if they once thought it was worth nothing.